Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon if you are watching us in the future. And we are here today with a very special guest. I'm going to introduce her. It's This activity is part of our literary talks, which is a cycle of different meetings with people related to contemporary literature, and we are going to be um, asking questions to different people, and we have already talked to translators and researchers, different authors, and today with us we have Susan Elmslie. Um, we were having we had a different a previous guest who could not be with us due to some health issues, and Susan was so very kind to be with us in order to help us complete this cycle of different conversations. And it's good because our previous guest was Marge Piercy, and Marge Piercy was the reason why I met Susan some years ago, because we attended Marge Piercy's poetry workshop. So Marge, in some way, somehow is present here with us in this moment. She put our lives together, and I met this wonderful person we are going to be talking to today. So I'm going to read some brief information about her from her website, and if she has anything she would like to add later, please feel free. And after that, I'm going to give the word to Davi, Carolina, and Alaine, who will be asking the questions. They are the group responsible for talking with Susan. So, Susan Elmslie is a poet who writes and lives in Montreal, Quebec. Her second collection, Museum of Kindness, is available in bookstores and online now. Her first trade collection of poetry, I, Nadia, and Other Poems, won the Quebec Writers Federation A.M. Klein Poetry Prize and was shortlisted for the McColliston First Book Prize, the League of Canadian Poets Pat Lowther Memorial Award, and Relate Award. Her poems have also appeared in several Canadian journals, anthologies, and in a prize-winning chapbook, When Your Body Takes to Trembling. Born in Brampton, Ontario, she has also lived in London, Ontario, and spent year-long stretches in Nice and Vancouver. She received a PhD in English with a specialization in Canadian literature from McGill University and an MA in comparative Canadian literature from Western. Her poetry has been supported by Canada Council for Arts grants for professional writers. She has also been a resident at the Banff Center for the Arts and a poetry fellow at Hawthornden Castle in Scotland. She was one of the judges for the 2020 Montreal International Poetry Prize. So, Susan, it's very, in fact, I feel a little weird calling you Susan, because for me, you have always been Sue. And
Yes.
welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. This is so fun. It's a really nice experience to speak with you.
Yes, I'm really glad you accepted this invitation. I feel really honored to have this conversation with someone from abroad. And I hope you like it. I hope we can exchange some experience, some knowledge, and I hope we can have a good chat. Sue, the first question we would
Yeah.
like to ask you is how do you perceive the act of writing? And this question is because I've heard before many writers saying that writing is a necessity for them, an act of freedom. So, how do you perceive it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Uh, I've been writing since I was a child, since about the age of 10 or so, and I did want to be a poet. Um, though I didn't know really what that, would look like uh, as an adult, if somebody could actually be a poet and only a poet. And I see writing and fatal. I wish everybody wrote poetry. I know some people think too many people write poetry, but I'm the opposite. I wish everybody wrote poetry. I think it's fundamental to being human, so it is necessary. I think of, the phenomena of guerrilla gardening. When people take an urban space that is overgrown or vacant and they start to plant things there, flowers, they beautify the space, they take it over in a kind of secret way, and make it into a beautiful space. That's what I think poetry is like. That's how I approach it, as something vital for the sort of landscape of our lives.
Well, that's a really pretty way of putting it. The second part of the question is, what made you decide to publish your writings and to be an author? Actually, you already answered it, but what made you make it public, your writings?
Yeah. Um, well, one of the reasons I wanted to become a poet was because I saw a book of poetry when I was a child by a famous Canadian poet named Leonard Cohen. And, I thought, wow, what is this kind of language that he's writing? What is this? And so I saw it in book form and thought, well, I guess that can be done. And then, when Elton might remember this, I've been publishing since long before that, but I think Marge Piercy was right when she said that you can't, it's not good to just write and keep your writing secret. The idea that you can connect with somebody, that you can do for somebody else what somebody's poem is, um, and the main reason that I publish my work, so that somebody else who's going through an experience that they haven't been able to name doesn't feel so alone.
Great, Carol.
The next question we have for you, you kind of answer it, but I would like to hear a little bit more.
Sure.
How was your relationship with books and reading when you were a little girl?
I love.
And
Oh, sorry, go ahead. And
did you always like to read and write?
I did. I really did like to read and write, but I mostly read novels when I was, a young reader, a teenager, a kid. I read children's novels, um, and I didn't know what was, considered good literature. So in Canada, we have a literary award, the Governor General's Literary Award, and it awards prizes in all sorts of categories, including children's literature. There's a poetry category, there's a fiction category. So I started to read Canada Council, like the Governor General's Award um, uh, prizes, the literary books that had won these prizes, as a way of knowing that I was getting something that was, I guess, viewed as strong work. So I did. I read avidly novels. I would stay up late into the night. My mother would tell me to go to bed at 3:30 in the morning, and I would say, "Okay," and then I would just keep reading. So I read avidly, and I always liked to read and write. I didn't trust verbal language very much. I was shy and I didn't talk a lot. So I always would write things down. Beginning of being a poet.
Nice. And this next question is um, more about the present. Do you have um, any plans on publishing new materials in short term?
Not in the short term. um, though I am working on a new project with a writer friend of mine, and a friend of mine. we're working on poems and drawings, writing about the concept of winter interest, which is a gardening term for the things in your, because we have winter here, right? And winter is long. And so we're writing about the phenomena of things colorful in art, and even through the winter, in just a textural way, the kinds of things that produce berries that birds like, or the things that are pretty through the harsh winter. And that's a metaphor, I think, for what sustains us during hard times. So that's the metaphor and the concept that we're working with.
Really nice. I'm looking forward to read it already. And what is your most recent reading? What are you reading now?
Oh, what am I reading right now? Okay, so wow. I check in fairly regularly with the Poetry Foundation site. Perhaps you're aware of it. It's a really wonderful resource. United States, based in United States, available everywhere. And every day there's new poems. So I check in very regularly with the Poetry Foundation site, and I'm thinking of like the book of poems that I most recently bought or am looking at. I'll get back to you in a little bit because I'm having trouble sorting out like what's at the top of the list, what's the most recent that I've been in. Reading poems. I could recommend books that I've read in fairly recently, but I'm not sure what the most recent one is, so I'm just going to defer on that. Circling the question.
Okay, so in the first question, you were talking about what is important. Why is it important to you to publish your writings in a way of connecting to people and maybe helping them? Um, so I want to ask you: do you believe literature can transform, change people, and has it changed you in a way?
Yes. I mean, Auden said poetry makes nothing happen, but it was also poetry makes nothing happen, that you can, like Anne Waldman says in one of her poems, putting makeup on empty space, I think is her poem, that you can create. This is one of the things I love about poetry, is you can create something out of nothing, out of language. You can evoke the deepest or unnameable feelings and experience. So that's amazing to me. And I'm somebody who says that I think poetry can say sort of a large thing to say, but who have become poets out of some kind of suffering or trauma. Now, poetry is not therapy. Any serious poet is connecting to poetry throughout time and sometimes across subgenres, and like they're connecting on the level of craft. But there's also something about being able to name what seems unnameable, being able to, um, you know, delve into what seems unutterable. That I think, and to have a voice. Um, so for people who would otherwise not have any kind of a voice um, publicly, I think that yeah, poetry can save lives. Many people who read it, encountering that language can be really affirming.
Yes, it was beautiful. Beautiful. I loved your answer, and it made me remind me of uh, the relationship literature have with psychology and the
Yeah,
unnameable. and how our subconscious can be present in what we write, in what other people write. So it was really good. Thank you, Carol.
Also, like the idea of
Yes, yes.
transforming or changing. Yes, I mean all our experience does transform or change us, and I think that poetry generally is an experience that can change us for the better because it's about, you know, often connection. It's about the celebration of what makes us human and a celebration of language.
Great. Carol?
I really like your answer. It's very beautiful. And I want to know if this is why you chose to stick with poetry instead of other literary genres.
Yeah, well,
Or there's
one thing that poetry does for me is I can work on it in my head. I can carry a poem even if I have no way of writing it down at that moment. Like if I'm in transit, you know, I'm one of those people that will sort of talk into their phone if I get an idea, or you know, jot a note into a notebook. But there are times, many times, that I'm interrupted. I teach full time. I have a child who has a disability and another teenager, and poetry has always been something work on, and it's also me a truly free art. Um, as a child, I didn't have very much money growing up. We couldn't really afford lessons, ballet lessons or piano. We didn't have a piano. You know, you can always borrow library books for free, and you can apprentice as a poet by reading other poets. You don't have to buy paints or canvas. You don't have to have any expensive tools. You can work solely in the oral tradition. You don't even necessarily have to be able to write to be a poet, which is amazing to me. And I think that makes it one of the most powerful art forms there is. You don't have to be able to read music. You know, you can be a poet and have almost no resources in order to do it. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I like it. Now, it's one of the reasons I like it too is that you can't pay somebody to do it well. You can't really make a living per se as a poet. So it's free and it's sort of like material constraints that way, and it can't be sort of like monetized. Mm.
Thank you. Eileen, I think it's your question next.
Hello, nice
Hi.
to meet you, Susan. Um, there are some students here and they like to write too. I'd like to know if you have any advice for them to write.
Yeah, I do. I think it's important to carry a notebook or a phone if you have one that you know you can talk into, a way to record, some other way to get ideas down when they come, because we all sort of live in poetry a little bit. Ideas, images, random little tidbits cross our mind all the time, and unless we write them down, they're ephemeral and they'll go away. So it's okay, you know, if for people who don't write or whatever, they have those moments. We all have them, but a writer, a poet especially, has to remember those things and record them, to write them down. So that's key. Always have a way to get that stuff down, because you think you'll remember it, but you won't. Life moves fast. And the other thing is to read poetry a little bit whenever you can. You know, make it a part of your life. If it's poetry that you like to write, or whatever genre, have something doing that and getting inspiration from it. Because, like, well, do you go to art galleries every now and then? Whenever you do, don't you go away thinking, hey, I could do that. I could paint. I'm inspired. I want to paint or sculpt now. The only difference between myself and the artists in the gallery that have worked there is that they've done it and I don't. So likewise with poetry, the only thing that separates somebody who's got a lot of writing and somebody who doesn't is that you just do it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your tips. I am not a writer, but I like to carry a notebook with me because when I have these moments, I like to write it down to remember, even though I don't write about it.
Well, you are writing about it just in a journal where you keep those things. That's
Yeah,
that's
that's true.
right. Public, but that's supporting that's kind of what makes you a writer. That's the sensibility I think that that any writer has.
I hadn't thought by this way. Okay, thank you. Our next question is, what do you like to write about? What do you rather write? Do you have a specific theme you're always writing?
I think that many writers have kind of an obsessional theme or themes that they keep coming back to, even when they don't realize they're obsessed with it, and keep coming back to it. Uh, Many times I have come back to the idea of I needs to be feminized or being living as a woman in the world. So I've written before about say a young girl in Sherbrooke, Quebec, who was murdered. That she was just a woman on the street who was grabbed. So violence, against women, against children, is something that I tend to come back to in various ways. And then the counter sort of narrative to that is kindness or, being at home in the world in various ways. So um, there's a tension for me that I think I tend to gravitate towards. I guess I am to some degree preoccupied with that polar extreme in human nature of the propensity for violence and also, love on the other side of that.
Can I jump in and ask a question that was not on our?
Sure.
It was we didn't thought it before. Those things you like to write about. And I'm sorry if this question is really personal for you, but it just made me curious. Are them related, the violence theme? Is it related more to a fear of yours? You have fear of violence, or because, or is it related to a society that you're looking forward in the future to build? You know, how does this theme connects to what you believe? That was what I was curious about.
That's a really good question. A Canadian fiction writer that I admire is named Diane Champerlain, and in one of her stories, she has an epigraph. She says, "If a story is not to be about love, then it must be about fear." And I that kind of struck me. Yeah, some of the poems that I've written about have been about particular fears. Published or not, I've written about the fear of finding a dead body, somebody who was harmed. That's a personal, terrible fear. And then when I was pregnant, I was personally afraid of having somebody like take my baby away from me before the baby was born, and I didn't even know there was a term for that. Um, it hadn't been in news that much before, but now there is. It's called fetal abduction. And so I wrote a poem about that, that fear. But then also I do write about, and I try to live this way to make the world that I want to live in, right? It's to write poems about um, what might be hard experiences or the so-called hard disciplines of life, but that you can take some wisdom from too, that you can, be shaped by that to make, to become a more empathetic, kind, loving person, not a fearful person. So I guess.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
Mhm. We'd like to know when you want or need to write but can have ideas, what do you do and where do you find inspiration?
Well, that's a good one. So when I was growing up, there weren't that many, or at least I didn't know about them. There weren't that many textbooks that, were designed to teach people how to write. Now there are so many of them, and I do use them in teaching creative writing. So I do exercises in those books when I assign them to students. I do them, and I create exercises too, and then I do my own exercises. There are so many wonderful exercises out there, whole books of them, that are really sort of genius in terms of like writing prompts, getting people to do things. One of my only creative writing teacher, Don Mackay, when I took a course at, in Ontario, used to call those things spurs, what people use on their boots when they're horseback riding, if they're a Western rider, to make the horse go a little bit. They're prompts or spurs to get you writing. And if I don't have inspiration, I just try a writing exercise, or I try writing in a specific poetic form, finding the good subject to match it. Like if I have a subject and I want to write about an idea or something I'm preoccupied with, I try to find the right form that will go with it. So those are some of the things that I do to get going, to find inspiration. And I also let my mind wander. The things that we keep coming back to over and over again in our minds when we think about things. Sometimes I ask myself, why am I thinking about this? And then thinking about that, the why, and helps get into it, why my mind is preoccupied with it. And then a poem can emerge from that.
Just a curiosity, it wasn't in the program as well, but do you used to write daily? Because I know that it's really important to have consistency
Mm.
and to, I don't know, do you do you used to write daily? What do you usually write?
I used to write daily, and in certain times when I'm in a period of high productivity, like if I'm working on a specific manuscript, I will write daily. But there are other times when I'm in what, you know, what my husband once called a fallow period. So, fields, if you've ever, flown in an airplane and you look down at fields, some of them are like, they look like dirt, they're lying fallow, and some of them are growing crops. I think all creative writers, all creative people have periods of productivity when they're creating, and then other periods that are like fallow periods where you're absorbing and you're living. And then in your next active, writing time, you will draw on that material. So I don't feel bad about not writing, although I have a certain sense of urgency about it because we only live so long. But I don't feel bad if I don't write every day in a specific window of time. Like I didn't write a lot during the pandemic. I was just treading water, just trying to live like everybody else. Some people might have written a lot during that time, but that wasn't my experience. Now I'm inspired poems about interest. So I try to write down, at least in a journal, like you're using, Carolina, ideas, images, and that kind of thing.
Okay. And about your writing, what is your favorite and why? And if you can talk a little about it to us.
Okay, so you're asking, of the poems, say, that I've written, which one still speaks to me or I feel proud of? Yeah. Okay, so, and it may not be because I don't. My friend, Rachel Rose, who was poet laureate of Vancouver, and before that, a longtime friend. We've talked, many people know what their strongest work is. I'm not sure about my own stuff. People like different poems of mine than I like. So, one of the ones that I feel good about, and I don't know if anybody really likes this poem or will, but it's a poem called, Miracle, and it recounts, or talks about an experience that I had about rereading a poem that I had taught many times, um, after a specific experience, uh, in a psychologist's office where I took my son. And the psychologist, when he was a very little boy, said that he would likely, um, live in a living when he got older. He wasn't neurotypical, and at that time, it was really hard to process that. So when I went to teach this poem, all of a sudden I saw something different in it. It's a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, and when I read it, it was like the top of my head came off, like Emily Dickinson says about poems. And I felt like, as I say in that poem, that the skin of my life was caught in the teeth of the poem and it sang through me. And that experience of reading a poem that doesn't sort of hit you in any kind of personal way at one point, but later on will really just sort of grab you where you live. I'm proud of myself for having, been able to recognize the sacredness of that experience. I think is a kind of miracle. So I'm happy about that, even if it's no one's favorite.
Okay, thank you.
Could you tell us a little about your writing process? When you started a new poem, do you have everything in your mind, or they just come up?
Um, well, I could talk about. I think it varies. Some poems, people say, just sort of come to you, and I have a poem or poems like that. Um, my poem, "A Poet Has 9 Knives," came to me while I was doing dishes. When you're washing cutlery, and there's that expression, has 9 knives, and there happened to be nine. And then I just made up a little rhyme about it, about what these knives are metaphorically for the poet. So that just sort of came to me in a spurt, a burst. Um, and I could recite it if you wanted. Do you want me to? Yeah. And then others, take a long time. One poem, a poem called Box, I worked on for more than 10 years. It eventually won, the ARC, which is Canada's poetry magazine. This is the most recent issue. It won the ARC Poem of the Year contest, and I was surprised because I'd worked on it for so long. I revised it. I had this idea that I kept sort of like chewing on, and eventually hammered something out and revised, and then sent it off. And I spoke to somebody else and meant something to them, but the process varies. I think sometimes I have an idea and I find the form to express it in, and sometimes I try writing in a form and see what will work with that. Yeah, all over the map.
It's interesting how we don't have rules, specific rules for writing. Sometimes it just comes. Sometimes it's a hard work, and that's interesting to me. Um, but we're actually, there's two more questions. We're coming
Okay.
to the end of this conversation. Uh, but something that caught my attention when we were searching about you, Sue, was that you received a PhD in English with a specialization in Canadian literature, and you also have a MA in comparative Canadian literature, as Professor Elton mentioned it. And given that, I was really curious to know uh, if your research, the research you carried out these past years about literature, if they have influenced the way you write, the way you express yourself, or if it has nothing to do with your writing.
Well, it's funny because there are some things about earning a PhD that are useful when it comes to creative writing, and that's like knowing how to do research. Um, research did play a part in my collection, I, Nadia, and Other Poems, in which I researched the relationship of André Breton to his surrealist muse, Nadia, and who she really was, and where they, spent time together and things like that. So, read help there. But in some ways, and I'm just going to mute myself for a second, cough, because I've got now a little tickle in my throat. Sorry. Okay. In some ways, a creative writer has to forget what they know as a critic or scholar. Otherwise, you might you might cater to that kind of mind in your writing. And I guess I should just speak as me. I wondered when I was doing research and writing academic work, there's always that, is my work good, right? There are people that will criticize your work and say where your work is weak, or, what poetry, it doesn't matter what other people think per se. There are going to be people that are wrong about your work. Even if they have the strongest convictions, they're not going to get it, or they're going to have another agenda, or they'll misread it. Or they could be right, but it doesn't matter. So in that regard, what I learned as a scholar does not pertain to what I write as a poet. But my interest in my research in the later stages was about material culture and the kind of stuff what we live with in everyday life, what objects signify. And so, yes, I think that gave me a good sense of how to refer to specific concrete details and find books to reach into us and speak to us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this is the last question, but after that, I think we have to check if we have any questions in the comments section.
Sure.
But for now, I want to ask you about prizes, literature prizes. We know that you won some of them. The Quebec Writers Federation AM Klein Poetry Prize is one of them that you won. And I want to know if for you as an author, what is the importance of these types of prizes? And do you consider them a way of making literature more popular, or a way of getting people more close to literature, maybe? So what is the importance of this type of prizes for you?
Another writer that I admire, Michael Ondaatje, wrote in one of his books, "There Are No Prizes," which always resonated with me, that one can't work, I think, do work creatively with the expectation of winning prizes, though it's always a nice thing if that happens. It doesn't, you can't have that kind of external motivation, um, inspiring you to do more writing. It just, you can't control it. um, so yes, I mean, they're very nice. I wish there were more prizes. I wish more people felt validation for their efforts, but unfortunately, there aren't enough, and there are so many good writers out there who receive prizes during their life, and if there were just some way to encourage them to go on, that would be wonderful. So I feel ambivalent about prizes. I certainly would feel happy to win one, especially if there's money, because that helps, but they're not the reason to write.
Sure, sure. Oh, thank you for answering all the questions. We're going to see here in the comment section if we have some
Great.
of them. Yes, we do.
Okay.
Thais sent us a question. She said, "Good night. I have a question. I don't know if it's been asked before, but I would like to know if, for Susan, does the literature have any social role?"
Yes, I do think so. You know, it's never as a way of gaining access to other worldviews, other experiences to which we would not be privy at all or have any kind of lens into if it weren't for people writing from those subject positions, and letting us know what it's like, from their space and their um, eyes and their hearts, right? I think it has a social role to expose us to worlds, societies, families, that we wouldn't otherwise get to meet in any sort of way necessarily. I'm not sure if that's the kind of answer you were looking for. I also think that that writer, it's a different question, I guess, but it's the question of how much responsibility do writers have to their audience, and maybe that's too too large a question for me right now, but yeah.
Yes, I actually think that this question, if literature have any social role, is a tricky question.
Yeah.
When we study literature theory, professors might say, "Oh, there's no role. Literature hasn't any compromise. It's not compromised to anything. Um, Literature is just literature. It's
Right,
art."
art for art's sake, right?
Yes, yeah, art for art's sake. That's it. But I love that point of view of thinking that literature has a social role, mainly because when we teach literature, when we talk about literature in education, it certainly has a role, not only for educating, but building and kind of uh, developing a critical thinking. That's what I like to think. That's what I have in mind
Yeah.
when because I'm studying to become a teacher, an English teacher and a Portuguese teacher. So that's what I think, and I loved your answer. So thank you for that.
Okay, our next question is from Professor Elton. What is something unique about Canadian poetry, and what poets from around the world do you know or inspired you?
Okay, so what is unique about Canadian poetry? Uh, I've read a lot of Canadian poetry. it's I can't really say what's unique about it in the world of poetry. There's world class Canadian poetry, that's for sure. Um, but it's just it's not possible to sort of characterize it. There's people writing in long forms. There's people writing short lyrics. There's people doing concrete poetry here. That's absolutely fantastic, like visual poetry. We have spoken word artists. We have all the kinds, right, of poetry that there is. There are people in Canada doing it. And what poets from around the world do you know? Do I know, or who have inspired me? So I like quite a few American poets, but I also like I like the poetry of Wisława Szymborska. That really, the Polish poet, Nobel laureate, that is really visual poems as well as the scope of her work. Seamus Heaney. Let me think now. Sinead Morrissey, an Irish poet. I like her work. And normally there aren't whole, like, I usually don't say to myself, I like this poet's work generally. I tend to like individual poems. So for me to have named just a few poets whose work I've read and never not liked a poem, I think, I'll leave it at that. But certainly there's so much poetry, world poetry, that is inspiring.
Okay, thank you for your suggestions. We are certainly going to look for these poets. And I think we don't have any other question, but we actually have a request.
Okay.
We would like you to read a poem of yours to finish
Okay.
this reading.
Do any of you have a particular subject that you would like the poem to speak to? Because
The one that you feel comfortable on reading.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'll read this poem, which I think often I get asked by people to read because it's about the school shooting that happened in my workplace. And it's spoken, I think about the experience that I had going back into the classroom after the school shooting. Which is a phrase that people use to describe, giving people a little heads up that there's something shocking, potentially triggering in a literary text or a film or what have you. And I didn't know what a trigger warning was at the time. So this is called trigger warning. The sun was shining outside, or it was raining. There were windows, but none of them opened. I was wearing clothes, but I was naked that first day back in the classroom after the shooting. The next story we were scheduled to read was The Things They Carried. And when I stood before them and opened my mouth, I gave what was the first trigger warning before I knew what such a thing was. The story had guns in it, and I didn't know if, should we read it? Or should we strike it? No answer. I asked again. Silence. They were looking through me as though I were the window, and I was looking at them like they were a door with an unanswered phone ringing behind it. They wouldn't have names anymore because I was afraid to love them. Finally, somebody said, "We don't care." Nobody disputed this. I was silent for a long time. Then I got my paper cup of coffee, raised it to my mouth, and poured it down the front of my blouse.
That was awesome. That was awesome. We actually have one last minute question. Uh, it's sad because I didn't want to break the atmosphere you bring with your poem. It was beautiful. But Daniel asked, which work did you most enjoy writing, and how did you feel when you finished writing it, and how do you see it today?
Wow. Okay, so I really have enjoyed all the the sequences of poems that I've written, but I did have a special sort of level of enjoyment for writing poems for I Nadia and I Nadia and other poems. These poems are from the perspective, some of them, of um, Leona Gislaine, I forget her, Delacour, who was the person known as Nadia because it is the beginning of the word hope in Russian and because it is only the beginning, who was the muse for André Breton. So I loved writing those poems. And I worked on them for a long time. And just at the very tail end of when I was working on them and the book was about to be published, or, I had only a few more of them to write, I felt. I came across the letters that Nadia had written to Breton that came up for auction at an auction house. And they had little thumbnail views of these letters, so I could see her actual words that she wrote that had been hidden and been held by a private owner since. And I actually wrote a poem that borrowed some of those words and then, took it further than that. So I was really excited for having written those poems because I felt like I tapped into her voice when I heard her voice in print. Yeah, it was a thrill.
Okay, so I think we have finished the questions and we are almost getting to our time. And I would like to ask you, Sue, if you have any other comments or anything you would like to have said and you didn't. Out of so many questions we had, sometimes we forget something that's very important because we don't know, right? Something you would like to have said and you didn't. So if you do, please let us know. And if you don't, I'm going to just end here with some thanks.
I would say one thing, and that is that we tend to look at poetry at threshold moments in our lives. When people die, sometimes a poem is read at a funeral as part of their eulogy. When babies are born, sometimes people give the parents a poem. Or when we get our hearts broken, first love, we read poetry or write poetry. It's at these threshold moments that we turn to it, which to me suggests it's real sacred power in our lives. And I would just encourage people to look at it, more of it, to read it, to explore it, because it does, I think, touch on lots of experiences that we have in life.
Thank you so much for your presence here with us, for taking a little bit of time of your busy life and sharing some ideas and making our life a little brighter, because you were bringing a touch of poetry and you were also bringing a touch of uh, someone who has a different experience than the one we have here. And it's so important for us to be open to these dialogues, to these conversations. So I hope it's the first talk of many talks that we have also in the future. And so this is our last activity for this cycle. It's the first cycle of literary talks as a kind of official project. Last year we had some unofficial, let's say, the beginning of the project, because we were in remote education. So I had the idea of inviting some people to share some experiences, share their points of view with us during our classes of this class that is called Contemporary Literature in English. So probably next year we are going to have a second round or a second cycle of different conversations. And I'm so happy that we were able to accomplish these 5 meetings about different topics like translation and research, and prose poetry, different people from different parts of the world. Okay, so thank you for being with us. All the videos are in our channel here. They will be here if you want to refer to people to come here and watch. Some of them are in Portuguese, some of them are in English. And I hope it's the beginning of this beautiful, great conversation. I like this. There is a researcher that I like that says that normally, like, art tends to be like a great conversation, and I think we should keep talking and keep exchanging. So thank you everyone for watching, and thank you for you, Sue, Carol, Davi, and Alani for being with us. Bye bye.